Before that time.
It's the physics behind, for example,
Another
the reactions.
question people
The
say
reaction, the actual change in
under
mass.
the ultimate question about
during
the profit
the course of the 7 years
and
the book was put together.
Mr. Johns, can you give us some background and history and rationale behind the My Brother's Keeper initiative?
Happy to, but before doing so, I think it's important to step back a little bit and provide some context. And so it's important to note that President Obama established an initiative that I have the pleasure of leading called the White House Initiative on Educational Excellence for African Americans in the second term of his administration. It is the newest of now 6 total White House initiatives, all focused on leveraging population or constituency-based efforts to close specific opportunity and achievement gaps. And so I think that is really sort of important, understanding that My Brother's Keeper as an initiative was established after the president had already done an analysis of opportunities to strengthen our communities and improve the country, specifically by focusing on those most often neglected and or ignored or underserved. And so following the establishment of, again, the White House Initiative on the Educational Excellence for African Americans, the president established the My Brother's Keeper initiative. And there are 3 primary goals, I think, that are worth celebrating or at least highlighting when talking about the initiative and its sort of foundational underpinnings. The first is to really highlight the rate at which boys and men of color are failing to achieve. If you look at most quality of life indicator ladders, boys and men of color are at the lowest rungs, whether we're talking about access to employment or education, being victims of suicide or homicide, almost anything that would indicate whether or not one is thriving in our society. Boys and men of color are at the lowest rungs. And so the president stood at the White House and talked about some of these statistics, right? The fact that boys and men of color, in particular African-American boys, are suspended and expelled, for example, before they start kindergarten at 3 times the rate at which they are in K-12 combined. And not only that sort of shared that as a data point that we should all be familiar with, but to remind us that it's a problem that too many of us are familiar but are no longer moved, right? That we become numb to the fact that these challenges exist and have persisted for quite some time. So I think the first one is to honor that these challenges exist and that there are ways for us to identify and leverage meaningful solutions to try and move past them, right? The second thing very much connected to that is celebrating individuals and organizations who have been doing the work of working in communities, with communities, urban, rural, isolated, throughout this country to support boys and men of color, but also communities of color. And so the president stood with the Chicago MORE program, if I'm remembering the name of the program correctly, but a program that leverages a cohort approach to ensuring that brothers are responsible for themselves and for one another. And so by connecting with and amplifying the efforts of programs like Chabot College's Striving Black Brothers, or Ron Walker's A Coalition of Schools Educating Boys of Color, or Chris Chapman's Oakland Unified Schools District's African American Male Initiative, the My Brother's Keeper initiative was able to, again, highlight and celebrate those who are doing the work. And then I think the third thing is to honor the adage that this is village work, right? The work of supporting the cognitive, social, and emotional development of all young people requires every caring and concerned adult to realize that there are really no lay people in this work. And so the third thing was really to highlight opportunities for everybody to show up in some significant way in the lives of young people. One of the primary ways in which the call of action has been sort of administered is to remind people that not everyone can show up as a classroom teacher or a formal educator, but we can all mentor. So there have been lots of energy expended and effort expended to ensure that adults connect with, in meaningful ways, young people, to try and close some of these achievement and opportunity gaps. So I think those 3 things are among the most important.
How is the White House initiative dealing with the disparities in quality between communities of color and other communities in terms of quality child care and early childhood education?
Yeah, so really important question, and I think it's worth trying to unpack a little bit, right? And so there are at least two things at play, right? One is how is it that we are working to increase access to high quality early care and education programs? And then the second is sort of, I'll talk a little bit about the ways in which the federal government is leveraging resources to strengthen communities, right? And to honor the assets that already exist in our communities and African American communities specifically. So to the first point, we have spent the White House Initiative on Educational Excellence for African Americans has spent a considerable amount of time investing energy in that priority, right, and increasing the number of Black children and families that are enrolled in high quality early care and education programs. So specific to our community, it's been really important for us to acknowledge that a lot of Black babies are in early care and education programs, right? Whether that's child care, Head Start, Early Head Start, some pre-K programs of different types of arrangements, right, in terms of the day and the ratios and averages. But the question is whether or not when our children are in those programs, I wasn't going to call them babies. I'm inclined to call them babies. I always do. Comes from being a kindergarten teacher. The question is, are our babies, when they're in programs that are of sufficient quality? And for African American children and families, the answer is too often no. And we know that that time, right, between when a child is in utero and the time that a child is 5 years of age is the most important in any child's life, right? It is a time where neurons are firing at the fastest rate, right? The synapses are going and the foundation upon which all future learning and development is being formed. And so we have a responsibility really to ensure that all of our children are able to show up in the way that Asa Hilliard sort of celebrated, right, which is to honor that I've never met a child in particular, a Black child who was not a genius. And there's no secret to how you support them. Asa said that we first acknowledge them as human, and then the second thing is that we support them with love. I think my addition to that would be that the third thing we do is ensure that they have a solid, healthy, early start. And so that's the first piece of that, right? And we have worked with the National Black Child Development Institute in particular to make sure that communities that have significant concentrations of African American families are armed with not only the information about how important early learning is and development at that age, but really where there are resources that they can connect to. So the second part of your question, there are a couple of points that I think are worth celebrating. One is that this administration, President Obama, has invested several $billions to increase access to high quality early learning programs. That's significant not only because he talked about the importance of early learning while he was a candidate in the first term, right, running as a senator, but including one of the first actions he took when he was in office by passing the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, invested in that bill alone $6 billion to increase access to high quality home visiting programs, child care, Head Start and Early Head Start. Since then, this administration in particular, the Department of Education and the Department of Health and Human Services have continued to invest in and work with states to improve systems that are designed to monitor, support, improve quality over time, to increase the rate at which children who have particular needs, right, low-income children, children exposed to toxic stress and trauma, children who are homeless, children who literally are having physiological reactions to living in some of our most challenged communities, under-resourced communities, to providing them with access to these types of programs. But related to that, through programs including Promise Neighborhoods, Promise Zones, or other attempts at leveraging executive authority and flexibilities to allow and encourage both states and localities to use otherwise separate pots of funds or resources to be able to braid systems of support, right, in ways that meet the needs of our children and our families. And so those are, I think, just a couple of things that are worth noting in both of those spaces as we think about the importance of early learning and the importance of working with and in communities. And my hope is that, not hope, but I think we'll continue to see what those investments will yield in years to come.
What about teacher preparation? What kinds of things or initiatives are coming out of your office or the federal government level in terms of improving teacher preparation at the early childhood years?
Yeah, so I think a couple of things are important in this space, right? One is to honor that a child's first and most important educator are his or her parents, right? And so both the initiative, the White House Initiative on Educational Excellence for African Americans, and the administration more generally have done a lot of work to not only celebrate and honor the role that parents and families play, right? And it's important for us to honor the ways in which, when we talk about Black kids in particular, parent could be an uncle, right? A blood relative or an adopted uncle, right? It could be the grills on the corner who ensure safe passage to and from school. So it's about honoring the roles of the people who show up and stand in the gap for our children, and then equipping them with the resources they need in order to be meaningful partners in the process of supporting learning and development, cognitive, social, and emotional. Separate from that, there are a couple of things that we've done to support educators, both teachers and leaders at every level. One is to honor the importance of those who teach the babies, right? Our work, the work of the initiative is supported by our President's Advisory Commission, which is chaired by Dr. Freeman Rabowski, who's president of UMBC. And he has said something that I now quote at least once a week, which is that educators do God's work. And so we spend a lot of time simply celebrating that and reminding everyone that there are few things that you could expend your time or energy in that are as worthy of engaging in as teaching a young person, as spending time helping to develop or cultivate the skills and passions of a young person. So that's one. The second thing that we've done is spend a lot of time supporting diversity within the workforce, right? So I taught kindergarten and third grade in New York City. And know that less than 2% of our nation's workforce looks like me, right? That includes men of color, especially at the earliest levels, right? There are very few of us, right? Talk about unicorns. When you talk about teaching babies or teaching elementary school. And so we spend a lot of time talking about the importance of diversity with a capital D in every way, shape, or form, but really specifically encouraging men of color to consider entering into the profession and or staying in the profession, right? So teaching and leading. That takes a number of forms. We've hosted at the U.S. Department of Education a summit to support male educators of color, and also have relationships with individual schools and networks of schools who do this work and that are again aligned with the goals of supporting the teachers who teach our babies, right? The third thing is removing barriers to entering into the workforce, right? So we have a resource guide that's available on our website, www.ed.gov/AFAM-education, that not only talks about the need for and opportunities within the profession, both teaching and leading, whether that be a school superintendent or a principal or any number of other opportunities, but also identifies federal resources that can be used to help allay the financial cost and or otherwise minimize the burdens that one might see as a barrier to entry into the profession. I think the last thing that's worth noting connected to each of those is that we have highlighted every week African American educators and a newsletter that is sent out by the U.S. Department of Education, again as a way to remind people that there are African American educators who are doing phenomenal things in communities throughout this country and even around the world, and that although we don't do it enough, we should be encouraging one another, in particular our children, to consider careers in teaching, right? There's not one among us who can claim any level of success that can't connect that in some meaningful way to an educator that helped to make that possible or at least affirm us along the way. And then the third thing is, again, to sort of strengthen the community of African American educators who are engaged in this work.
Okay. Now, you've recently been involved in writing a paper with Dr. James Comer and Dr. Barbara Bowman. Can you tell us a little bit about that paper, and has it come out?
Not yet. So
do you want to talk about it at all?
Yeah, no, happily.
Sure,
yeah.
sure.
So again, the work of the White House Initiative on Educational Excellence for African Americans is supported by a President's Advisory Commission, a presidentially appointed body of some of our nation's leading experts in a variety of fields. Two of the members of our commission, in addition to Chairman Freeman Rabowski, president of UMBC, are Doctors James Comer of the at Yale University, who's also the founder of the Comer Child Development development model, as well as Barbara Bowman, who's at Erickson Institute, and who is also responsible for working with Secretary Arne Duncan to establish this administration's early learning agenda in the first term. And so we have worked through the commission to develop a position paper that highlights, again, some critical opportunities to support the learning and development, cognitive, social, and emotional of African American children, but then to also leverage the existing infrastructure of the National Black Child Development Institute, as well as other programs like Head Start and Early Head Start, to ensure that, one, African American children are enrolled in high quality programs, two, that the communities that are charged with caring for and supporting African American children are as equipped as they can be and as supported as they need to be, in providing all of our babies with everything they need in order to not only learn, but to really thrive, right, in school and in life. And then again, to ensure that we are doing the work of sort of serving as a liaison between our stakeholders, those affiliate directors operating early learning programs through NBCDI, or the parents and families that access those programs, really taking the best of learning from what they're experiencing and being able to ensure that that's included and or otherwise considered in meaningful ways as the federal government continues to do the work of administering grants or programs, or otherwise leveraging resources to, again, increase access to opportunity for our children, our communities, our families.
Okay. Let's go back to that whole issue of more men in early childhood education. Could you just speak to that just a little bit more in terms of why it's important to have men in the field of early childhood education?
So it is especially important to have men in the field of education, period, full stop, right? And that's in every way, shape, or form. I think far too often men, in particular men of color, in formal spaces of education are relegated to being police officers. I was trying to think of a more elegant term because it doesn't always take that form, but the role is to often be there to intervene whenever there might be an incident, to be a presence so that there is not an incident, right? Or to otherwise literally put our bodies on children. And so for me, when I reflect upon my own personal experience, I am a black boy from Inglewood, California, the product of a non-nuclear family, first-generation college graduate who left Inglewood to go to Columbia University in the middle of New York. And one of the most fascinating things about my educational journey is that I often found myself isolated, right? Being in public schools and very privileged communities where I was the only black student. Being at Columbia University, where out of 4,000 undergraduate students, as a black male who went to a public school, I was less than 2% of the student population. And I spent a lot of time sort of questioning, why is this the case, and how do I make sense of the fact that in Inglewood or in Harlem, I could walk outside and trip over a number of black boys, but when in spaces where power is preserved, and or the sort of hidden curriculum is unlocked, I'm often alone, if not in the company of few. And so teaching kindergarten on 110th and Broadway, right, less than 5 blocks away from Columbia University's campus, less than 15 blocks away from the center of Harlem, where there was not a single black boy out of 56 kids, was traumatic. At the time when kids are genuinely and so very innocently attempting to make sense of who they are and their place in the world, to watch little girls play house and not be able to factor in a black boy, or to sit and listen to my students as they engage in conversation during morning circle, and to not have a version of me be present in that in any way, shape, or form, was not only difficult personally, but also manifested itself in the ways in which my children not only interacted with each other, but also then interacted with me, and or the absence of me in other spaces. And so I say all of that, and I'm hopeful that that context is helpful in underscoring how important it is for all of our kids to see pieces of themselves reflected in the world around them. And especially in education, in formal educational settings, all children deserve to see men of color, black men in particular, conspiring for their success. For two reasons. One, it's the world we live in, right? In spite of the challenges that people of color, right? We talk a lot about, in the context of My Brother's Keeper, the need to be intentional about supporting black men, but we also have to be sensitive to the unique needs of black women and girls, right? We often now quote the 3-to-1 statistic for suspension and expulsions for black boys compared to their non-black male counterparts, but the statistic is 6-to-1, right, for African American girls. So acknowledging that there's a need for us to be intentional about honoring the diversity that exists for all of our kids, in particular for black kids. I fundamentally believe that when children are able to see people who don't look like them conspiring for their success, that it does something different for them too. And so our initiative, the White House Initiative on Educational Excellence for African Americans, recently launched a screening and discussion series, right? Honoring the power of multimedia, the importance of storytelling, the necessity to do exactly this right here. And one of the films that is included in the screening is 3.5 Minutes, right? And it tells a story of the murder of Jordan Davis, a young man who, after a really unfortunate but not surprising encounter in a gas station, was murdered. And I will go to my grave fundamentally believing that if Michael Dunn had had a black male educator who at some point throughout his development loved him, struggled with him in the way in which educators do with, the way in which adults do with children, right? As we sort of learn and grow and develop and test boundaries. But had otherwise been present in some meaningful way, that interaction in that gas station would have been different. And while it's important to honor the uniqueness of that moment, right, specific to Jordan and Michael, that incident, right, that interaction, the moments in which black children, when black boys are perceived as being problems before they're ever acknowledged as being people, can be reduced by increasing diversity in the workforce in a very direct and tangible way. And so we spend a lot of time celebrating the work that educators do in a country that spends much more time honoring those who dribble balls and sing songs. Those things are important as well, but imagine how different our communities and country would be if we spent half that energy celebrating those who participate in academic decathlons, or who are finding cures to seemingly intractable diseases, and otherwise are working at improving the lives of people in some fundamental ways. Again, not to suggest that there aren't other ways to do that through sports and entertainment, but there has to be some level of parity. And so we spend a lot of time, again, attempting to honor those who do God's work while encouraging other people to consider ways to do the same.
All right, well, we've covered a lot, and if there's any one last thing you want to say, now's the time.
Yeah, so I think the last thing is that the My Brother's Keeper initiative has been an especially powerful platform to highlight opportunities to and the need for us to be intentional, and not only honoring that there's power and precision, but in celebrating the uniqueness of men, in particular men of color, right? And I always think about it in Sula, Toni Morrison called Black Men the Envy of the World. And there's something to be said for that. But as we do the work, as we continue to do the work of being our brother's keeper, it is also incredibly important to be our sister's supporter. Again, while the popular narrative is that women are doing better, On the average, that's true, right? Not only for white women, but for African American women who are outstripping a lot of people with regard to achievement and success. But there are some unique challenges that African American women in particular, our girls, are facing. And we have to be especially sensitive about and responsive to their needs, all of our girls. But we also have to honor that there are members of our community, they're babies, who don't fit comfortably in either of those categories. And we only do ourselves as a community and as a country a disservice when we act as if they don't exist and fail to find unique ways to show up in their lives as well, right? So people spend a lot of time debating, questioning, asking rhetorically and otherwise whether or not Black lives matter. And then that is often parsed out in arguments about who matters more within that community, right? And it's really important for us to own and celebrate humanity, period, and to show up and protect and love and educate all members of our community, no matter how they show up.